We're going to start with just a little bit of clarification, a little bit of a qualifier. The reason that we have to do this is because there are two different versions of NeuroStandards, of the NeuroStandards initiative, that are floating around amongst you. So we just want to clarify so everybody knows, so you don't confuse the two. When the ARF launched into this initiative, it invited many of the vendors who have biometric and neuromeasure methodologies to participate in the validation study that we're talking about today. 8 companies took up that challenge. 2 did not, and that's fine. However, one of those 2 then decided to launch their own initiative, which is also fine. But then they called that initiative 5 days later after the announcement. They announced it and they called it the same thing, the NeuroStandards Initiative. So there is now some confusion. So we just want to clarify that the ARF NeuroStandards Initiative is actually different from NeuroFocus's NeuroStandards Initiative. And so we just say that so there won't be any confusion in the room about that. Now, but I'm here today to talk to you about the ARF's NeuroStandards Initiative. So this is a very exciting opportunity, which I look forward to talking about. Last year at this time, I spoke before you talking about a challenge that we had at the Disney Labs. And the challenge was that we were getting pitched business by a lot of different neuro vendors, and we did not know how to properly assess the different claims that were being made. And on that basis, we issued a challenge to the ARF, which they took up, to launch into some type of a validation study that could explore that. And I shared with you Arthur C. Clarke's third law, which is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And with many things in life, that's what we want. We want the magic. We love technology because it's magic. But the minute we enter into the arena of science, and this was my response to that, by its very nature, science must be distinguishable from magic. And so if we want to call this science, then we have to have some process for review so that we can make sure that the things that we're being told, in fact, actually do say what we think they say. And this is a normal part of the discourse of science. So the background to this collaboration really was, of course, there is growing popularity around many of these new neuromarketing measures. That's a very exciting prospect, particularly because it's giving us access to very different kinds of measures, exploring things like emotion, et cetera, which we're very excited about. There's great promise, but there was also great concern. And how could we then engage in a process which helped tease out some of those differences? And how much of what we were seeing was really science and how much was art? Clearly, at some stage, there is interpretation. Much of that interpretation is very human. And we wanted to get a better feel for exactly where the science starts and the art kind of kicks in. So this was entirely consistent with the ARF's mission, and so the ARF, to its credit, took on the leadership challenge and launched into this project. And so really what we were trying to do in this project is glean some useful insights which advertisers and marketeers could rely on through a process of independent review of both the neurological and biological methods, as well as the fundamental underlying science and the validity of the types of conclusions that people then draw from that, from those methodologies. We had a fantastic community of sponsors for the initiative who were deeply engaged with the project. We had, as you see over here, we had American Express, Campbell's, the Clorox Company, Chase, Colgate-Palmolive, GM, Hershey's, Miller Coors. Because we had Miller Coors, that meant that a lot of the testing that involved the ads they provided had to be done with people who are 21 plus. But basically, we took 8 ads from these gold sponsors, and we gave them to all 8 participants in the the vendors. And we said, now go ahead and do what you normally do and come back and report exactly what you find. We also had a number of media sponsors. We had ESPN, MTV Networks, NBC Universal, and Turner. And we also had some silver sponsors in the projects, including the A&E Network, Dentsu, Warner Brothers, Publicis, and Starcom MediaVest. And again, thank you to the sponsors who made the project possible. Now, what was amazing, I think, about this project is that we had a really wide range of methods through these vendors that was available for the review process. There were a number of vendors who used different approaches to facial coding, studying and analyzing facial muscle movement. We had a vendor who did biometrics, looking at different type of biometric measurements, including skin conductivity, heart rate, etc. Looking at EEG measures, SST, which is a derivative of the EEG methodology, steady state topography, and fMRI. And we actually had all of these methods then applied to the different ads that were seen. So from the facial coding side, we had Sensory Logic, who use a human coding. So they use human coders to code the different facial muscles based on the science of Paul Ekman. The reviewers were really impressed with the ability of Sensory Logic to actually be able to test even in people's homes using webcam feeds, for example, during a test session. Gallup and Robinson used facial electromyography, which is actually wires that are attached to the face. A little bit invasive in some ways, but they did a very good job before the review panel in defending the compromises that they've made to make sure that the experience is not too invasive and the high quality of research personnel that they allocated to the task. Interscope, who used biometric. What was particularly impressive to the review panel about the work of Interscope was some validation work that they had done using stopwatch data from TiVo, looking at second-by-second, basically, viewer engagement, and correlating that with the biometric measurement to demonstrate that there was actually some relationship between their biometric measures and what the audience was doing. There was MSW Lab. Many of you would have seen perhaps the lab presentation last year at the ARF. The review panel was particularly impressed with the benefits, the very significant benefits that we had seen in the growth of the approach that was being used by the MSW Lab over the past year in this engagement between expert providers, vendors, and market researchers, and the complementary measures that were then coming together in the way they pursued their science. SANS Research, who is very unique because they manufacture both the hardware and, of course, also provide the analysis. So they had a really thorough understanding kind of end-to-end of their particular technology. MindLab International, which is based in the UK, MindLab are a community of academics. They have developed a very impressive machine learning protocol at the calibration phase of their study, which was very impressive, and they were very open and honest around a lot of the limitations that they encounter, which was very refreshing for the review panel. NeuroInsight out of the UK, out of Australia, sorry, who now have opened their offices in the United States and in the UK as well. NeuroInsight, the review panel was very impressed with their constructs, which were very well supported through the literature. And then, of course, NeuroCompass, who do fMRI research based at Stanford, who did a fantastic job in looking at some very specific kind of footprints associated with deep mind, kind of deep brain activity, and how that was related to the outcomes. The review process involved different stages. There were expert reviewers as well as a review panel as a whole, which brought the results together. So to articulate the process, first we had subject matter experts. So this means that if your methodology was fMRI, we had independent academic experts specifically in the fMRI arena who analyzed and reviewed that research. And it was the same with the biometrics, with EEG, with the facial coding. And we also had some people who reviewed based on classic academic literature on marketing and advertising, et cetera. And they all provided very detailed reviews. And the review panel was very impressed with the very high quality of the reviews that came through the subject matter experts. Then this went to the senior review panel, which was a very impressive group of researchers, independent researchers, chaired by Horst, including Dr. Patty Barwise from the London Business School, Dr. Chris Chabris, Dr. Annie Lang, and Dr. Renee Weber, bringing all these different methods into the mix as well. And then there was a research retreat. And the research retreat was really interesting because the individual vendors took questions and had to basically interact with the review panel, but they also met with each of the brands. And so there was an opportunity on two levels, one to kind of review the science and one to review the actual utility of many of the findings. So on that note, I'm going to share with you one of the gold sponsors and their particular experience in this project.
What I'd like to do in the next few slides is really just to illustrate the process by giving you some feedback on, as one of the sponsors, our reaction to this whole process. And I would just like to thank Duane for the animation on these slides, where I think he's trying to build some emotional connection as well to the audience. So thank you for that. I think, what we've seen certainly is that what people say and what they do often are very separate. Understanding human behavior is incredibly complex, and many of us have seen the growth of neuroscience-type tools in the last few years and have become very intrigued about whether they could provide the answer to human behavior. So I would like to just take this opportunity of thanking the ARF for leading this initiative. This independent review truly is a great initiative to try and bring some sort of discipline to the way we look at this. But I'd also like to back up Duane's comments and thank the 8 participants who were very brave to put their technologies out there, who were really sort of putting themselves out there for assessment, and hopefully they've learned as much from this process as certainly I as a sponsor have learned. And we've been experimenting for the last couple of years with various vendors, and so for me this was a great opportunity to understand a much broader scale of vendors than I would ever get to see just by doing it in isolation. So the stimulus we used for this creative was a piece of advertising for Colgate Total, which was new in 2010. It basically showcased the 12-hour germ protection. It used a proof in a shopping mall type scenario that had been used outside of the US. And interestingly, for the first time, it didn't feature Brooke Shields. So I'll show you that piece of creative, so then you can just give you a little bit of context as I give you some of the sort of the information we learned about this. So that was the piece of creative which was assessed by these 8 vendors. And these are some of the findings we got back. And as you can imagine, we had pre-tested this. And so some of the findings we got back were reinforcements of what we learned. So for example, most of these vendors thought the advertising would be good. And I put it that way because, in fact, what they defined as good varied quite considerably between the individual vendors. So there were some people who were picking out elements that would make it good and others picking out different aspects. Several identified that the germ scan, that little sort of passage, generated a response. But they weren't always able to say whether that response was positive or negative. They knew it generated a response. And so some people interpreted that as being a positive thing and some interpreted it as being a bad thing. About half of the vendors identified that 12 hours were working well. But conversely, about half of them didn't pick up that the 12 hours was working well. So you begin to see that across 8 vendors, there was not a whole lot of consistency. In some areas there was, but differences. Some of the new learning, there was a lot of comments that the branding would be very good. And you may know I work for Colgate, so you can probably recognize it as a Colgate ad. But our initial in-market testing actually had suggested the branding wouldn't be very good. And our tracking data also endorsed that. We've made some changes, and it's now working very well. One of the most interesting new learnings we actually found out about was the opening piece, when the woman sort of steps into the camera and asks, "What did you brush with?" That generally got a lot of comments back from these vendors to say that that generated an emotional response. That's quite intrusive, and that wasn't something we had picked up at all in our previous testing. Having said that, some of the vendors would then say, but your characters are very warm and inviting, and some of them said your characters aren't really going to resonate with your target audience. So again, they were interpreting the information received in different ways. And nobody contextualized the fact that this piece of advertising didn't feature Brooke Shields. And Brooke Shields had been our spokesperson for about 10 years. And I think I'll comment upon that and whether the companies really understood perhaps communication strategy that we had been adopting. So in terms of some of the general sort of feedback points, there are a huge number of new measures. Just from Duane's introduction and some of the terminology, I was rapidly going back to my days when I graduated with a degree in science of trying to keep up with all these terminologies. And it is very hard to try and understand some of the language and some of the validations that are being shown for this information. There was a huge amount of passion for their individual approaches. People would speak very positively about their own tools, were less accepting of somebody else's. So very much people who'd been working in their particular field for 20 years were very strongly, this is what I believe in, this is the right way to do. And some of these approaches are much easier to grasp. The idea of looking at somebody's face and being able to read the emotions makes intuitive sense. Some of the fMRI type technology is a much deeper level of understanding to appreciate it. And most of these suppliers had been coming to us previously and in these sessions and saying, we have validation and we have academic endorsers. And I have to say, I have a degree in chemistry, but that certainly doesn't position me very well for understanding a lot of this. And I think, you know, when somebody talks to you with a PhD from MIT or Harvard, it feels very hard for me to challenge the validity of their approach and tools. So, some general thoughts. This is positioned often as science, but a lot of the words that I heard as a receiver of this information were interpretive words like possibly or likely. And that's not necessarily words that perhaps quantum physicists always use. They're very much more rigorous. So certainly this is science and interpretation. The reports themselves were perhaps not as concise and sort of as punchy as perhaps you would like to see. There may be 20 pages of introductions before you'd be able to pick out, well, have I actually got anything new here that I'm going to see? Some of the recommendation pushes a theory. One particular vendor said, you know, your advertising would be much better with music. And that had absolutely nothing to do with the research results, but had a general sort of passion and belief. So again, where did the science end and where did the sort of the hypothesis begin? And that always wasn't very clear. And I think that was something we feel should be separated. When is it factual and when is it a hypothesis? No problems with the hypothesis, but let's make it very clear that it's not coming from the data collected, for example. Many of these companies have got huge academic sort of expertise, but probably have not worked in the advertising industry for any length of time. And so some of their recommendations, some of their conclusions would be beneficial if they actually worked more closely with communication partners, whether it be advertising or even some of the conventional sort of research companies who've worked in these areas. And I think the other thing that becomes very clear very quickly is that some of these tools really have limited opportunities for scalability. An fMRI machine, which may cost a few $1,000,000, is not a most transportable item. Some of the other approaches, as we've mentioned, you know, you can use a webcam. So there was definitely some scalability and usability restrictions that we found. So in terms of one thing I would like to say is that, you know, neuroscience, many of these things take hundreds of measures per second. Seems incredibly compelling. Maybe they're collecting it from hundreds of different data receptors. So suddenly there are hundreds of thousands of data points. And it looks very granular. But I think, you know, like any good book, any good movie, communication is more than just the series of the individual words. And it's very easy to forget what the forest looks like when you're just counting the number of trees. We do have to step back and say this is a 30-second creative. It isn't just about a series of data points taken every 100th of a second, for example. So in terms of what I believed as a sort of as a client for this project, in terms of next steps, these new tools do not replace 100% the conventional. So I think Ipsos and Millward Brown and various other companies can breathe. I don't think communication is suddenly going to go to these companies. But they are very complementary. And I think, as Duane indicated, it is great excitement and potential with these tools. What I do think is there needs to be a greater partnership between many of these companies and the research sort of agencies that are out there today. And I know a couple of announcements were made recently about some of those partnerships, and I think that will continue to be a very positive way forward for this area. Some of these tools are probably going to be best suited to probing areas which are very difficult for humans to communicate why they like something or why they don't like something. The moving imagery of a 30-second TV advert with words and images is a very complex piece for some of these tools to get. But maybe, you know, a simple fragrance, which is very hard for people to articulate why they like it, maybe this has an opportunity there. And what I would say, and I think we heard it from one of the panels yesterday, is start working with some of these vendors, get them to know your business. The more they know about your business, the more they'll be able to pay back. So maybe nobody picked up on Brooke Shields because we hadn't told anybody about Brooke Shields, but certainly that becomes through the partnership piece. And so finally, this is still very much art and interpretation. There is no EMC squared type equation. There isn't 2 parts person, 2 parts music, and 3 parts, you know, sort of imagery leads to 2 quotients of persuasion. This is very much, this is measurements which need to be interpreted in just the same way as any other sort of research data. And it needs to be very clearly spelled out when we're dealing with a fact and when we're dealing with an interpretation leading to a hypothesis. And it's absolutely fine and correct to have those hypotheses, but it just needs to be very clearly stated that this isn't a fact in the way that science often likes to present itself. And so with that, I'm going to hand it across to Horst, who's going to talk about some of the ARF conclusions and next steps.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you see, this is a very, very complex field, and we have half an hour, and we urge to end on time. So we have prepared a booklet that has some more detail about the field, the investigation that we did, the whole project, the retreat, and more details about the issue that issues like some of those Duane and Richard talked about. So when you leave in a few minutes, the booklet will be available for you. Furthermore, if you're interested in this issue, hear more about it. There's going to be a deep dive at 4:30 in the Insight Zone. It's also sort of the start of a new project that we're starting in this context, which is part of the ARF's forums. So this is going to be the first Neuroforum session. So let me use the remaining time to just summarize what I think are some of the main points here. The ARF started this project, and we're very, very excited about this project and all the feedback that we've been getting. But what we heard from our members is we're very, very excited about the potential that we hear about these new methods. We are excited about the possibility of getting more information about the emotion, and we hear about very successful applications that some of our colleagues have had. But on the other hand, there are some concerns. We have questions. We're not schooled in this area. It is new. It is a developing field, and we want to hear more about the kind of issues that Richard just talked about, which is what is science, what is art, what do we need to look out for, how much validation is there, can you help us develop standards? And that's really the motive behind the ARF project. And sort of to sum up some of the thoughts that we're having about suggestions, if you want suggestions for best practices, the development of standards in this area, this is what we would say. Use these studies in connection with the work that you're doing, for example, commercial evaluations. Use them in that context, use them as an additional tool to give you additional insights, but not as a replacement. Think very carefully about what you want to find out and communicate that to the vendor. And try to match your objectives, your research goals, with the different kind of methodologies out there. As you saw in Duane's part of the presentation, there are all of these different methodologies out there, and some have very, very particular strengths for particular issues and others for other issues. So that's something that I think can help you. And as you just heard from Richard, even if it's based on science, even if there are, a lot of really, really fantastically schooled experts who are working with you on this, it doesn't mean that everything that they tell you, comes directly from the scientific evidence. There is interpretation involved. And further, just like in any study, discuss the sample size, discuss issues like sample composition, how the sample is drawn. Discuss the methodology, the measurement. Discuss issues like statistical significance. Whoops. And I really want to stress this point. Do as you would in all other studies. And I really want to stress, we are not picking, and nobody's picking on this field here. These are things that we should do, always should do, and we should do it in this case too. So, we're very, very proud to announce, because of the interest in this field, because of the issues, because of all the feedback that we've been getting from the ARF membership, that we want to continue this project and announce the following steps. Number one, you heard this presentation, you will be getting the booklet, but we're also going to do a white paper with much more detail, with a lot of different voices, some from the expert reviewers, and we're going to continue inviting people like Richard who have used these methods in practice to achieve more information for their business goals. So that's going to be very useful. Number two, as I mentioned, we're going to start our forum. We have a leadership, Janet Gallant from NBC Universal, who's in the room, Richard, who you just heard, and Bob Woodward from Campbell, who, by the way, also was our very, very gracious host at the retreat that we had. So they're going to lead this forum, and one of the agenda points of this forum, above information sharing and all the issues that you can imagine revolving around this, is to explore what we would call NeuroStandards 2, a continuation of this process. Maybe conduct another study to help with more validation, to encourage collaboration between the different vendors, and just move this field forward. And finally, last but definitely not least, you heard from Duane about the fantastic independent reviewers that we employed here and how incredibly useful their reviews were. And I want to invite Duane to come back up and talk a little bit more about this. But the ARF has decided that under the leadership of the ARF, we're going to make expert reviewers available to the ARF membership. So if you're planning to do a study that involves neurological and biological research, you have this opportunity, you have this chance to get additional input from an independent source with expert training that can help you use these methodologies, use these vendors to your best and get the best out of it and make them even more useful because you have this additional insight. Duane, you want to add to that?
So, in conclusion, this was a modest step in a lot of ways, a very challenging task in a lot of ways as well. 10 years from now or whatever, when they look back and see this first step, I think what people remember will not so much be the technical details that will be articulated in the white paper. The creation of the forum, I think, is a very, very positive step. It creates a community around which these issues can continue to be explored. Certainly the NeuroStandards 2.0 initiative will be very exciting. But the one thing that I hope you will all leave with today is just how groundbreaking this idea is, that now you have available to you independent expert reviewers through the ARF who can help you as you look to evaluate and assess the utility of these different tools. Effectively, the ARF is introducing the process of peer review into this industry process, and I think that's a very exciting model. This has benefits for everyone. For you as clients, of course, this means that you will be able to sift the different components of the reports to understand those areas where you can have the highest confidence and those where you can have your own confidence to kind of interject and have your own interpretation come into the mix. For the vendors, this means that we can lift the caliber of the game, because now vendors know that there are people out there who will understand their science and who will come in and they'll work harder and harder to lift really the quality of this industry. For shareholders, this is very exciting. A lot of the deals that are going down in this space reflect really big dollars, $1, $2, $10 million. Shareholders can now have confidence that there is an appropriate process for due diligence. For consumer advocacy groups, this is exciting because these reviewers will also comment on the ethical dimensions of what they're reviewing. And so now we have a voice of conscience that is also introduced. So what we have now, I think, is very exciting because you can engage with these new methods confident that there is a mechanism of support there available to you into the marketplace. And on that note, perhaps we have a few minutes for questions. The question is, will this be a general review of methods which you then have available, or will it be, there'll be many more vendors in the future? Or will it be something specific, say, to an individual proposal, etc.? So let me clarify. So what will happen is there is a network of reviewers. These are all experts in specific methodologies, and they're independent. They're not on people's advisory boards, etc. They are independent, it's independent peer review. You will contact the ARF and you'll say, Bob, I got a proposal. I want to evaluate this proposal. Or you will say, I got a report and I want to evaluate the report. There will be 2 to 3 reviewers for each of those proposals that are submitted. You will then, through the ARF, facilitate a process on your specific proposal or your specific report, and you will receive from those reviewers their comment on the science. And they will, it's not their job to step outside the science. They're not supposed to talk about something they don't have expertise in. They will be dealing specifically with the methodology issues, and they will provide their comment, and you will read that comment, and it will be up to you, really, what you choose to do with it. It's not a good, bad, was it a good thing, a bad thing? It's really looking at and dissecting and understanding all the very complex issues that are in that mix.
And you don't know anything about that company. Will those reviewers only be reviewing companies that are part of this ARF NeuroStandards process, or are they going to be commenting on clients they may never have had been introduced before, don't know anything about their methodologies, and then basing their review on not being familiar with a company? That's what I'm asking, because there's going to be a lot more companies in this space.
Thank you. So let me just clarify that what would happen. Let's say that you were the client and you approached the ARF and you said, we have a company from company X who was not, let's say, in this process, or who was. It doesn't really matter in that sense. And then what would happen is the ARF would contact the expert reviewers. Now at that stage, one of two things would happen. Company X would either comply and come to the party, or they would refuse. In either event, if they came to the party, you would then get the expert advice. If they didn't, as a client, that would probably raise some questions for you. It's not dependent on whether anybody participated in the NeuroStandards 1.0 initiative. But if they didn't participate in the initiative, then of course they'll be asked a number of questions that are associated with assessing their methodology. If they choose not to participate in that review, that is their prerogative, but ultimately it's up to the client what they would then do with that knowledge.